Thank you very much, Mr. Simeon. Yes, I'll start sharing my screen. So I've called this Moduloop functional extensions, largely because the two things actually don't have very much to do with each other, but we won't talk about that just for the moment. So, two separate areas for discussion. First of all, the question of an ISO 20022 version of Moduloop. And second, the questions relating to how to manage currency conversion and foreign exchange in Moduloop. So I'll take them in the reverse order from the way in which they are shown in the timetable, because the ISOs work we have already started on. We are actually doing work at the moment, whereas the currency conversion, we've done quite a lot of definitional work, but no, we haven't actually broken any sods yet. So let's start off then by talking about an ISO 20022 version of Moduloop. So first of all, just brief background. Why are we doing this? Well, central banks and market infrastructures are already using ISO 20022 messages. Global organizations like the World Bank want to concentrate on payment systems which are based on ISO 20022 messages. And existing banks, though it's important to emphasize this is not true of the other kinds of participants that we support, are used to using ISO 20022 messages to support payments. So that's really the rationale behind it. The benefit for us is, first of all, we get alignment with what's becoming an established international standard for payment systems. Second, we get the ability to influence ISO 20022 messaging to align it better with level 1 principles and the kinds of systems that we are interested in supporting and implementing. We also get the ability to extend the reach of the existing ISO 20022 messaging to new types of participants, new types of jurisdictions, and the particular requirements that they have. And finally, and perhaps less importantly, it removes some of the roadblocks to Moduloop entry for scheme operators and participants. The reason I say it's less important is that typically the people who are used to using ISO 20022 messaging are the people who have got lots of resources already. So although it's always nice to make things easier for people, these aren't the people who we really want to concentrate on making things easier for. However, we pass right along. Our original plan then was as follows. First of all, we would join the ISO 20022 organization. Second, we wanted to identify ISO 20022 equivalents to the FSP IOP messages in the Moduloop system. Once we'd done that, we wanted to map the data fields in the FSP IOP endpoints to the fields in the equivalent ISO 20022 messages. Once we'd done that, we wanted to pilot the conversion process from ISO 20022 to the internal Moduloop forms, first of all in Payment Manager. For those of you who are not familiar with Payment Manager, it's a proxy that we use for converting between the APIs that a participant understands and the APIs that the Moduloop switch understands, or indeed any other kind of conversion process. But that's specifically what we use it for. So the idea in this case is that a participant would send a message in ISO 20022 format to Payment Manager. Internally, Payment Manager would convert that message using the rules we talked about in sections 2 and 3 to Moduloop internal format messages, and which it would then forward to the switch. Once we had done that, our plan was to move that conversion process into the switch so that the switch would itself receive messages in ISO 20022 format, and they will be converted internally for processing by the switch. We also finally wanted to extend the existing message content to include the two must-haves that we identified when we first tried this out in the Bank of International Settlements hackathons back in March. And they were, first of all, the ability to use unique identifiers, UUIDs, as identifiers, which bizarrely ISO 20022 doesn't currently support. And second, the ability to incorporate the ILP guarantees, the condition and the fulfillment that give participants in our scheme confidence that that a transfer really has been completed by the payee and that everybody can clear the results in their books. So that's what we proposed for ourselves. How do we do against that? Well, we have applied to join the ISO 20022 organization. We've engaged Jason Pollis, who is a subject matter expert in ISO 20022 and already a member of a number of ISO 20022 committees, to support us going forward. The latest on our application is that it's been discussed positively in the main. We have achieved sponsorship from X9, which is the national ISO standards, sorry, the National Standards Institution for the Financial Services Business in the USA, which, as you know, is where Mojaloop is incorporated. It's gone out for comments. I believe that the deadline for comments is the end of next week, November the 5th. After that, if there are no significant comments, then we would expect the next meeting, hopefully, to approve our application to join. Jason is of the opinion that that might possibly happen by the beginning of December. So we're on track. There's nothing at the moment to make us think that we're not going to achieve that sometime in the coming PI. Second, we've identified the ISO 20022 equivalents to our Mojaloop messages for the 6-message funds transfer cycle. That is discovery, agreement, and transfer. So we have equivalents for each of the messages in that cycle. And that seems to be a fairly robust identification. We have also mapped the data fields in the FSPI, the Mojaloop interface, to fields in the ISO 20022 messages. Now, you'll see a bit later on that we have more work to do in that area, but we have done sufficient work to be able to support a conversion of payment flow from ISO 20022 to Mojaloop. And we've also piloted the conversion process in Payment Manager. We have an existing Payment Manager which will convert between the two and which is currently undergoing final user test in Rwanda. We haven't yet moved the conversion process to the switch, largely because we want to be sure that the process in Payment Manager has passed all its tests, including final approval by the customer, to avoid us having to do rework there. And we haven't yet got as far as extending the existing ISO 20022 messages, since we think that that is a piece of work that's best done when we are members and can actually represent our position on the various committees. So that's outstanding work. So it kind of sounds like we're doing okay, and sort of we are. So we now know how to use ISO 20022 messages to talk Mojaloop in particular cases. But the more we've looked at this, the more it's become clear that that's not the same thing as an ISO 20022 version of Mojaloop. In particular, an ISO 20022 version has got to be comprehensive, it's got to be general, and less important, it's got to be level 1 aligned. Sorry, it is important that it should be level 1 aligned, but to some extent, the level 1 alignment is taken care of in the first 2. So what's it got to do to be comprehensive? Now, that means we need to know how to do everything that Mojaloop does in ISO 20022. And where we are on that is, as we said, we can do a payment, but there are things that we can't do, because as far as we can see, there is no current ISO 20022 message, which supports some of the things that Moduloop does. And two important and obvious ones of those are, first of all, the Moduloop endpoint participants, which allows participants in the system to register that a particular identifier belongs to them. So that when the request comes through that says, I would like to pay merchant ID 123456, the merchant's bank or mobile money system will have registered that using the participants endpoint, so that the Oracle for merchant IDs will say, oh, okay, I recognize 123456, and I know that it belongs to this mobile money system. Now, this opens up a wider question around ISO 20022 and Moduloop, which I'll come on to in a moment. But certainly, as far as we understand it, ISO doesn't have that message at the moment. Another message which it doesn't have is the authorizations endpoint, which is used in the payment flow, or in some payment flows in Moduloop, to allow in-process verification of a customer. So the sort of thing, it was originally developed, I think, to support ATM flows, where the customer's standing at the ATM and the customer's bank use an instruction to the operator of the ATM saying, please ask the customer to enter the one-time PIN that I sent her. And the customer then enters the PIN. The operator of the ATM sends that back to the customer's bank, and that enables the customer to verify that enables the bank to verify that the customer really is there. Again, Moduloop doesn't have this. Sorry, ISO 20022 doesn't have this. So there are areas which we will need to have in order to be comprehensive. I'll come on to those in a bit more detail later on. And even where we use existing ISO 20022 messages, we have to know which parts of them are mandatory, which parts are optional, and which parts are forbidden. So the mandatory stuff is stuff, normally speaking, there is a reasonably good overlap between mandatory parts in the ISO specification and mandatory parts in the Moduloop specification, but it's not 100%, and we will certainly need to specialize and say, if you're going to use this in a Moduloop context, then you must fill in these fields. Also, we have to let people know which fields are optional and what optionality means, because there are really two forms of optionality here. One is you can fill it in or not as you please. It doesn't make any difference, but we will forward it to the recipient of the message. The other kind of optionality says you can fill this in if you like, but we'll just throw it away. So we will have to be sure that when anybody says, I would like to use this particular field in the ISO 20022 message, they have some way of understanding what using that field will mean for the Moduloop system to which or through which they are sending the message. And finally, there's a question of which parts of them are forbidden. And forbidden types of information are, for instance, the ISO 20022 messages that we're using to support payments have quite a rich way of defining agents. I mean, people who are acting on behalf of the person who is sending or receiving the payment. We don't use a system like that at the moment. Moduloop is built around direct relationships between participants, where although in some cases a participant may be being represented by an aggregator, as is the case, for instance, in Tanzania, as far as the Moduloop system is concerned, it's the aggregator's business to make sure that to the switch and to other participants in the scheme, it appears that they are dealing directly with the institution that the aggregator is representing. So we don't have built into Moduloop at the moment any concept of these agents. So my expectation is that one of the things that will be in our definition of modular loop ISO 20022 is you may not specify representatives and agents of various kinds. The payment works between principals. So those are examples of what we need to do in order to make our system comprehensive. We also have a problem of generality. Now, I hope it isn't a surprise to anyone that modular loop isn't a product. It's a way of building a product. There are lots of decisions that anybody who implements a particular modular loop will have to make about what kind of system they want to have. They could be relatively simple decisions, like what kinds of identifier types they want to support, what sorts of use cases they want to support. And they can be quite complicated, complex decisions about the kind of system they want to have. The ISO messages and business models are also a way of building a product. So we need some way of explaining to the people who are working with an ISO 20022 modular loop what the specializations of ISO 20022 mean for the implementation that they want to build, for how they want their system to work. So they need to be able to know what sorts of things the modular loop system insists on or forbids in relation to the more general landscape of the sorts of things that ISO 20022 in itself would support. So we don't, of course, yet know what that system is. So what we have to provide is a generic thing that says these are the kinds of things that an ISO 20022 modular loop can support, and this is why. So that's something that we need to get into. When I was writing this morning, I put in a level 1 slide, but I didn't know what to put in it, so we're going to skip right over that one. Okay, so what areas of focus might there be? First of all, modular loop, as I'm sure people who've been engaged with it know, uses identifiers. That is to say, it says, I have a particular identifier, which might be a mobile phone number, a national ID, an alias of some kind, a merchant ID, all of those sorts of things. And what I want to find out is which participant in the scheme will take the responsibility for converting that identifier to an account that can be, in this case, credited. So we are interested in working on identifiers, whereas ISO 20022 uses accounts. It wants to know where to direct, which account to direct a payment to. Now, the ISO system includes lots of other bits of information as well as an account number. It includes things like a mobile phone number, a national ID number, all of those sorts of things. So it's attractively similar to the way in which we do things. But that similarity masks a fundamental difference. And you can look at that quite quickly by just asking the question, what would happen if I sent an ISO 20022 message, which had an account number and a mobile phone number and a national ID number for the recipient? That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do in the ISO world because the account number trumps all of the others. They are just KYC information. But if we imagine that same request being submitted to a modular loop system and the national ID and the mobile phone number resolving to different institutions, then we have to answer the question, where should that payment be sent? What's the hierarchy between those forms of identifier? So there's a fundamental difference here, and we will need to make account or implement our version of modular loop with ISO 20022 in a way that makes it simple for users to understand how to do modular loop type things in it. I've already talked about authorization as part of a transfer, but there isn't, as I say, currently an ISO 20022 message to handle authorization as part of a transfer. There is nothing at present for currency conversion, which I'll be talking a bit later. Well, sorry, nothing for currency conversion as part of the transfer flow. There are currency conversion messages in ISO 20022, but they are about settling trades which have already been made, which is not really what we want to do in most cases. And there is also nothing in ISO about defining the relationship between third-party payment initiators and DFSPs. Now, that's what Lewis was just talking about. The process that's inside our system and is managed by our APIs, by which a third-party payment initiator can say, I would like you, Mr. Bank, to give me permission to debit this customer's account, provided the customer gives consent. And for the bank to say, okay, well, I am going to have to satisfy myself that the customer really does want to do that. And once I've done that, I will give you a special key that enables you to unlock his account or her account in future. Now, the actual transfer part of this, once we allow authorization, is relatively simple, and ISO 20022 doesn't have any obvious problems with implementing that. But it's establishing the relationship where, as far as I'm aware, there isn't currently anything in ISO 20022. ISO 20022 expects these things to be established out of band by some other process, which can be referenced in an ISO message, but there isn't any way to include the process in the ISO things itself. So where are we going to go with this? Well, the answer is what ISO 20022 calls a market practice document. Now, this is a document that we publish ourselves. We don't have to get approval from anywhere else for it. And basically, it describes how to execute use cases in an ISO 20022 module loop. That is, which messages to use, which fields to use or not to use, and what it means to use them. And as we've said, it will need to be complete. And I've just reiterated some of the issues that we will need to decide as part of the market practice document. So what we propose for the next PI is, first of all, a switch-hosted ISO version of module loop for one implementation. As you know, we're quite a long way down the road towards that, so we are reasonably confident about it, and that is work that is funded. Second, a version of our extensions to existing messages agreed by the ISO 20022 organization. So that's the unique identifiers and the ILP information. So once we've got our membership sorted out, we'll be proposing those more or less straight away as changes to the data model. And we then need to go on and sort out potential ISO 20022 solutions to the following issues, the ones that we've talked about already. And what that means is those solutions will be partly in terms of messages and partly in terms of the data model. We may need new elements in the ISO data model to cover them, or we may, or we may be able to use existing elements to create new messages and to get those messages approved by the ISO 20022 organization. And finally, we expect to have a draft module loop ISO 20022 market practice document, which we can brandish at the next convening as evidence that we haven't spent our entire time looking at interesting memes. So that's all I have to say on ISO 20022 at the moment. I probably won't pause for questions because I see we are racing with time. So if it's okay with everybody else, I will go straight on to talk about currency conversion and foreign exchange and try and pick up any questions. I notice there's a fair amount of stuff in the chat, but I haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet. And take any questions that we have time for at the end.